On April 9, 2009, in the state of Florida, lottery millionaire Abraham Lee Shakespeare was brutally murdered by the very woman who claimed to be his friend, Doris Moore. After committing the crime, Doris coldly buried his body under concrete behind her house, then continued living as if nothing had happened. For months afterward, she impersonated Abraham, sending texts to his family to mislead them and covering up the crime with elaborate lies. Even more cruelly, Doris took his lottery winnings to buy cars, houses, and invest in businesses under her own name. Faced with the horrifying scene and her cold, emotionless actions, the public was outraged. How could an ordinary woman become a cold-blooded killer? This is a true story. Watch until the end to uncover the shocking truth behind one of America's most disturbing cases. Like and subscribe to not miss future stories. Our main character, Abraham Shakespeare, was born on April 24, 1966, in Lakeland, Florida, into a poor working-class family. His parents did basic labor jobs, earning just enough to get by. Due to financial hardship, he had to drop out of school in 7th grade. At age 13, he was sent to juvenile detention for petty theft and remained there for 5 years. After release, he worked various manual jobs to survive, from lifting goods and day labor to garbage collection. However, the instability of these jobs kept his life in constant struggle and hardship. Despite his rough appearance and criminal past, people described Shakespeare as gentle, sincere, and affectionate. In 1999, at age 33, Shakespeare met and became close friends with Greg Smith, a local barber. Though not wealthy, Smith always helped his friend, offering free haircuts and paying him for small tasks at the shop. Thanks to this support, Shakespeare's life improved somewhat, but he still couldn't maintain steady employment. It wasn't until 2006 that Shakespeare landed a relatively steady job, loading trucks for MBM Food Delivery Company. There, he regularly worked with Michael Ford, the team's lead driver. On November 15, 2006, during a delivery trip to Miami, their truck stopped at a convenience store in a small town. Shakespeare stayed in the truck and asked Ford to buy him 2 lottery tickets. When asked about the numbers, he let Ford choose freely. That night, when the results were announced, Shakespeare was stunned. One of his 2 tickets hit the jackpot. 6, 23, 34, 42, 52. The prize was worth $30 million, beyond anything he could have imagined. Accustomed to having just a few dollars in his pocket, suddenly owning a fortune left Shakespeare in shock. He couldn't sleep all night, constantly checking the ticket to be sure. From that moment, a dream of freedom, comfort, and happiness began to form in Shakespeare's mind. However, that dream soon turned into a nightmare, launching a chain of tragedies Shakespeare never anticipated. The next morning, Abraham Shakespeare contacted the lottery office to claim his prize. According to regulations, he had 2 options: receive a lump sum with high taxes, or receive it in installments over 20 years with lower taxes. Shakespeare chose the lump sum. After taxes, he received approximately $17 million. Immediately, all his personal information was made public as per Florida law to ensure transparency. From a nobody, Shakespeare quickly became a famous millionaire, drawing massive media attention. Not long after, Shakespeare was sued by his co-worker Michael Ford. Michael claimed that since he bought the ticket for Shakespeare, he was the rightful owner and demanded half of the winnings. However, the court ruled that Shakespeare had paid for the ticket at the time of purchase, making him the rightful owner. In fact, Shakespeare had promised Michael $250,000 from the prize money, but since he hadn't received the winnings yet, the promise wasn't fulfilled. Unsatisfied with the verdict, Michael kept suing, but ultimately lost. With the money, Shakespeare bought a $1 million mansion, planning to bring his mother to live with him. However, his mother refused to move in. Later, he discovered the mansion was actually worth only about $600,000, meaning he had overpaid by $400,000. Still, Shakespeare didn't live extravagantly. He only bought a modest Nissan car, an old watch from a pawn shop, ate $7 meals, and maintained a simple lifestyle. He continued to go on walks, fish, and meet up with friends like he used to. Since winning the lottery, Shakespeare's life had completely changed. He became the center of attention from both acquaintances and strangers. Many people approached him asking for money. From distant relatives, old friends, neighbors, to the homeless, even people who barely knew him. Shakespeare didn't turn anyone away. He paid medical bills for the seriously ill, helped relatives with debt, and supported many homeless people. Soon, millions of dollars disappeared in just a few months. However, his generosity didn't bring him joy. The more he helped, the more exhausted, lonely, and disappointed he felt. Feeling used, he became increasingly withdrawn, living in doubt, exhaustion, and despair. On top of that, Shakespeare got involved in numerous investment projects, from invention firms, charities, to home renovation ventures. Despite having no experience, he still launched a home repair company and planned a non-profit to support the needy. But most of these investments ended up in the hands of people who took advantage of his trust. In a short time, he lost over $10 million, mostly through vague loans, uncontrolled investments, or outright theft. In October 2008, Doris Moore, a 36-year-old woman with a polished appearance, confident demeanor, and successful image, proactively approached Shakespeare. Unlike those who had approached him before, she didn't ask for money or propose a business partnership. Moore introduced herself as a writer, wanting to write a book about Shakespeare's rags-to-riches story. The idea made Shakespeare feel respected and heard, something he had lost over the past year. During the first few weeks of meeting, Moore didn't show any suspicious behavior. She focused on writing, had light conversations, and seemed sincere. This made Shakespeare gradually open up and consider her a close friend. Due to his limited education and lack of financial experience, Shakespeare began seeking Moore's advice on nearly all major decisions. With her confident appearance, persuasive speech, and seemingly experienced aura, Moore quickly gained his trust and gradually took full control of his finances. On February 9, 2009, at Moore's suggestion, Shakespeare established a limited liability company under his name to better manage his finances. However, full operational control was handed over to Moore. The company not only helped Shakespeare legitimize his income, but also created a shield to turn down loan requests. He often said, "All my assets are managed by the company. I have no decision-making power." Shakespeare saw this as the only way to escape the constant begging and exploitation that surrounded him. He felt relieved, believing the remaining money, though not much, was still enough for a peaceful life. More importantly, he believed he had found a smart, kind, and selfless woman. So he entrusted all his assets, documents, and trust to Moore. But Shakespeare had no idea that this very woman would lead him into a tragic, inescapable fate. On November 9, 2009, Abraham, Shakespeare's cousin, reported him missing after months of failed contact. The last time they saw each other was in April that year. What made Abraham particularly suspicious was that recent text messages sent from Shakespeare's phone were unusually fluent, despite Shakespeare being nearly illiterate. Not only the family, but online communities and amateur investigators also started questioning the situation. One detail that raised eyebrows was that Moore, who had full control over Shakespeare's assets, had moved her son and boyfriend into his mansion. Meanwhile, Shakespeare himself was nowhere to be seen. When police arrived at the mansion, only Moore was present. She claimed Shakespeare was alive and traveling the world to avoid those who had exploited him. Doris even showed videos, supposedly recorded by Shakespeare himself, where he appeared disappointed and wanting to leave his old life behind. However, many signs indicated Moore's explanation was unconvincing. The family, especially Shakespeare's mother, provided more suspicious evidence: a birthday card written too fluently with unfamiliar wording, and a phone call claiming he was safe, but the voice didn't sound like her son. Police verified and found no record of Shakespeare ever leaving the country. From the company account, $1 million was withdrawn to purchase a range of luxury items, including a Hummer H2 Chevrolet Corvette, a truck, and other expensive goods. Doris claimed she legally purchased the mansion for $655,000, and that the other assets were gifts from Shakespeare. Although her statement raised suspicions, police still lacked evidence to charge her. The key question now was, is Abraham Shakespeare alive or dead? Only by locating him, whether alive or his remains, could police direct the investigation. As the case stalled, a surprising figure appeared. Santoria, Shakespeare's ex-girlfriend. She stated that Doris Moore had offered her a $200,000 house and a car in exchange for lying to police that she spent the night with Shakespeare at the time he disappeared. Another acquaintance, barber Greg Smith, also spoke up. Smith, who had borrowed money from Shakespeare and was repaying it, revealed Doris once asked him to call Shakespeare's mother and lie, saying he was hiding due to a nightclub fight. These statements made police increasingly suspicious of Doris Moore's direct involvement in Shakespeare's mysterious disappearance. Following Santoria's statement, police decided to act. They approached Greg Smith and asked him to become an undercover informant. Understanding his critical role, Smith agreed immediately. A sophisticated listening device was hidden inside a Red Bull can, allowing Smith to record conversations with Doris at any time. On January 20, 2010, under a police-coordinated plan, Greg Smith prepared to meet Doris Moore to gather more evidence. Sensing she might be under surveillance, Moore grew cautious and tried to deflect attention. She believed the best way to erase suspicion was to prove Shakespeare was still alive. Moore asked Smith to write a fake letter in Shakespeare's name and secretly place it in his mother's mailbox. As a longtime friend, Smith was thought to know Shakespeare's writing style and habits, making the letter believable. Moore believed that if the letter was convincing enough, his mother would believe he was safe. The fake letter claimed Shakespeare was in legal trouble and might go to jail, but reassured his mother he was alive and said Doris Moore was helping him. To justify the writing, Moore added that Shakespeare had asked a friend to write it for him since he was illiterate. The plan seemed perfect, if Smith hadn't been working with the police. As soon as the letter was delivered, investigators seized it as evidence. Meanwhile, Moore still believed the plan was working. She thought that if Shakespeare's mother believed the letter, police would close the case as a simple disappearance. But the reality was the opposite. Instead of closing the case, police expanded the investigation, held a press conference, and offered a $10,000 reward. In panic, Moore kept contacting Smith for a solution. Taking advantage of this, Smith offered a solution. He said his cousin was wanted for drug trafficking and facing life in prison. If Moore paid enough money, this man would confess to killing Shakespeare. At first hesitant, Moore eventually agreed to meet Smith's cousin in person. Police immediately sent in an undercover officer using the alias Mike. During the meeting, Moore agreed to pay $50,000 for Mike to take the blame. However, Mike demanded she describe how Shakespeare was killed, and even asked to see the body or the scene to make his story believable. After some hesitation, Moore nodded. This was the first time she indirectly admitted Abraham Shakespeare was indeed dead. Shortly after, Doris Moore gave Smith a gun and a map showing the burial site. On January 26, 2010, Florida police discovered a body buried under concrete in the backyard of a house owned by Moore in Plant City. The body was that of Abraham Shakespeare, the lottery winner who had mysteriously vanished for 9 months. The victim had been shot twice in the chest, his body wrapped in plastic and hidden under a thick layer of concrete. The original crime scene was the mansion where Shakespeare lived with Moore. Biological traces found matched the victim's DNA. On February 2, 2010, Doris Moore was arrested in Florida on suspicion of involvement in Abraham Shakespeare's death. Doris Moore, born in 1972 in Florida, had a history of fraud and theft. She longed for wealth, loved luxury, and often faced financial trouble. After learning Shakespeare had won the jackpot, Moore immediately approached him, pretending to write a book about his life. Within just a few months, nearly all of Shakespeare's assets had been transferred to Moore or to companies under her name. This was a clear financial motive. During the interrogation, Doris Moore firmly denied all criminal actions. However, the evidence gathered by police formed a logical and strong chain, sufficient to charge her. First, Moore faked texts and witnesses. She sent messages from Shakespeare's phone, hired someone to imitate his voice, and tried to bribe his ex-girlfriend to lie. Second, location data showed Shakespeare's phone always moved with Moore's, proving she controlled all his communications. Third, the gun Moore gave to Greg Smith was confirmed as the murder weapon. She had previously hidden it at a friend's house. Fourth, evidence found near the body, gloves, tape, and plastic wrap, matched items Moore had purchased, confirmed by store surveillance footage. Finally, Moore's ex-husband testified that she once asked him to dig a hole in the backyard without explaining why. Cornered, Moore changed her story. She claimed a friend killed Shakespeare, and she only helped hide the body out of fear. But that testimony was dismissed due to contradictions and the lack of evidence proving the friend existed. The trial took place in 2012 at Polk County Court, Florida. The jury took less than 3 hours to reach a final verdict. Moore was found guilty of first-degree murder and armed robbery. The court sentenced Doris Moore to life in prison without parole for murder and 25 years for robbery, both sentences to be served concurrently. After the case, many charities and lawmakers in Florida questioned whether lottery winners' identities should continue to be made public. The incident also prompted several states across the U.S. to reconsider privacy protection policies for jackpot winners. Abraham Shakespeare's story was later featured in popular investigative shows such as Web of Death, Hulu, Buried in the Backyard, Oxygen, and several true crime podcasts. This case leaves a chilling lesson. Sometimes, too much luck can be the beginning of an irreversible tragedy. What do you think about the Abraham Shakespeare case? What was the biggest mistake that led to his downfall? Leave a comment below to share your thoughts. This video concludes here. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Rising from the bottom of society, Evelyn was fortunate to find a life of wealth and luxury next to her talented husband, Stephen Davis. However, driven by infidelity and greed for his enormous wealth, she ruthlessly hired a hitman to kill her own husband. The case had many hidden details, from the crime scene to the people who fired the shots that night, but the police deliberately ignored them and concluded it was a botched robbery. They didn't even investigate who these robbers were when they had taken a life. Stephen Davis's mother, Margaret, refused to accept her son's unjust death. Margaret began a journey to uncover the dark plot behind Stephen's death, and she was about to discover a truth more horrifying than any nightmare. The story she would tell would shock us all. Like and subscribe to follow the courageous journey of this mother right now. The victim in today's story is Stephen Davis, a name respected by many in the tech industry. He had it all: wealth, fame, a life that many desired. But he never expected that very success would lead him into the hands of a murderer. Born on March 27, 1970, Stephen grew up in Nottingham, England, in a relatively affluent family. At 14, his father died in a car accident, making Stephen the pillar of the family, taking on all responsibilities to protect his mother and 2 younger sisters. He had to work harder than others, and that perseverance made him a genius. By 21, Stephen became an excellent programmer, invited to work for a major company in Hong Kong with a salary 3 times his current one. He seized the opportunity immediately. In the following years, Stephen became a successful entrepreneur in the Philippines, running a tech company and earning millions of pesos every year. During this time, he met Evelyn, a beautiful, sweet girl who worked at a famous bar in downtown Angeles. Evelyn Davis. Hailing from a poor island in the Philippines, she had left home at 13 to seek a chance to change her life. Without any degrees or skills, the only thing she had was her beauty. And in her world, beauty was the only ticket out of poverty. As for Stephen, it was love at first sight, and he spent £500 to free Evelyn. From then on, their relationship grew closer. After a few months of dating, they decided to get married. Stephen Davis told his mother about his future spouse. But from his perspective, Evelyn Davis was just a regular worker, born into a farming family in the Philippines. When Margaret heard that her son wanted to marry, she felt a little worried, but didn't oppose it. A girl from a poor background wasn't a problem as long as she loved and cherished her son. In 1997, Margaret and her husband flew to Hong Kong to meet their future daughter-in-law. From the first glance, she had an ominous feeling. Evelyn seemed obedient and polite, but it was just a perfect mask. During their stay, Margaret observed. The more they interacted, the more she realized that Stephen and Evelyn had nothing in common. A knowledgeable man, passionate about technology, always exploring and creating. A girl who was illiterate, knew nothing about the world outside, only nodding, smiling, and enjoying life. But she had no evidence to stop it. Her son had fallen in love and made his decision. She didn't want to interfere too much in his choice. In the end, she accepted the marriage, though she was full of doubts. In March 1997, Stephen and Evelyn officially married in Hong Kong. But what Stephen didn't know was that Evelyn was only 17 years old. She had borrowed her sister's ID, falsified her age to 21, in order to meet the requirements for marriage registration. From that moment on, their marriage was a lie. Not long after, Evelyn became pregnant. Their first daughter, Jessica, was born, followed by their son, Joshua, 2 years later. After having their son, Stephen wanted to leave Hong Kong and move to the Philippines. His parent company opened a branch in Makati, and he was appointed as the branch director with a salary of £5,000 a month, a dream figure in the Philippines. But it wasn't just a career decision. It was also because of love. Stephen wanted to live where he had met Evelyn, a place he believed she would be happier. There, he rented a luxurious villa in an exclusive area for the elite in Angeles, 3 hours drive from the company. Every month, he gave Evelyn £1,000 for pocket money, equivalent to a year's salary of a local resident. Evelyn's life changed dramatically the day she became Stephen's wife. From a poor dancer, she rose to become the beloved wife of a wealthy family. But money was never enough for Evelyn. She grew accustomed to luxury, to expensive dresses, and lavish parties. And when greed exceeded its limits, she began to seek more. A life without Stephen. It started with unusual expenses. The £1,000 monthly allowance was no longer enough. Stephen noticed, but he turned a blind eye because he believed his wife deserved the best. But when Stephen began to control the finances, Evelyn became furious. She didn't want to be restricted, didn't want to be controlled. And most importantly, she had another man. Arnold, Evelyn's secret lover. A man who had worked as a security guard, not wealthy, but who knew the dark corners of society and how to make someone disappear without a trace. Evelyn whispered into Arnold's ear a perfect plan. If Stephen dies, I will inherit all of his wealth, the house, the savings, and the life insurance in England. The plan was set. 3 men, Arnold, Alexander, his friend, and a third unknown person took on the mission. They watched Stephen for weeks, learning his schedule, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. On the night of July 17, 2002, Stephen and his colleague Michael worked late, leaving the company to head to the apartment the company rented at 10:45 p.m. At 1 a.m., Michael returned after picking up his girlfriend from the airport. As they were about to sleep, Michael's girlfriend felt something was off. She heard footsteps outside the door, and a flashlight flickered under the door. The door was kicked open. 3 men burst in, one pointing a gun at Michael's head. He said to the man beside him, "Is that him? Is that him?" Michael panicked, shaking his head. They looked at each other, hesitated for a second, then quickly withdrew. But they didn't leave. They headed towards Stephen's room. The door to Stephen's room burst open. Then 4 loud gunshots rang out in the night. There were no screams, no struggle. Everything happened too fast. When everything was quiet again, Michael dared to run to Stephen's room. He was horrified to find Stephen lying motionless, blood pooling around him. The ambulance arrived, but it was too late. Stephen Davis was confirmed dead at the scene. Michael called Evelyn, but it took over 4 hours to reach her. He thought Evelyn would immediately inform Stephen's parents, but she did not. With no other option, Michael personally called England to break the news to Mrs. Margaret Davis. When she heard the news, Mrs. Margaret was stunned, collapsing into a chair. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. 2 days later, Mrs. Margaret and her husband flew to the Philippines to collect their son's body and clarify the cause of his death. But just 1 day after the murder, the Philippine police concluded that Stephen Davis was killed due to a business conflict. They claimed the murderer could have been a competitor or a business partner with conflicting interests. Michael, the witness to the event, immediately realized the absurdity. If this was truly a murder due to business conflict, then why did the killers ask, "Is that him?" This meant they were targeting a specific person, not a random murder. When Mrs. Margaret demanded further investigation, the police suddenly changed their statement. They said this might just be a case of mistaken robbery, that the criminals hadn't meant to kill Stephen. But Mrs. Margaret didn't believe them. She knew there was a hand behind this, someone who had exploited the police's sluggishness to cover up their crime. And she had a name in mind: Evelyn. Everything wasn't random. After receiving her son's body a few days later, with the sharp mind of a longtime businesswoman, Mrs. Margaret began to piece everything together. Unsolvable questions began to surface in her mind. First, when Stephen was killed, Evelyn didn't even call the family. It was Michael who made the call to England. Second, when Mrs. Margaret and her husband arrived in the Philippines, Evelyn didn't come to greet them. She didn't cry, didn't show any grief. In fact, the first thing she said wasn't a condolence, but, "Did you meet Michael? Did he say anything?" This statement haunted Mrs. Margaret's mind. Why was Evelyn more concerned with Michael's statement than the sorrow of her husband's family? Third, at Stephen's funeral, while everyone was mourning, Evelyn bluntly asked about money. She asked about the bank accounts and life insurance, as if her husband's death was just a small obstacle in her pursuit of a luxurious life. 2 weeks before the murder, Stephen called his mother, his voice heavy. He said his marriage was on the brink of collapse. Evelyn only demanded money, even stealing from him. She showed no concern for the children or the family. Stephen had begun to suspect his wife, but he didn't have time to do anything. When Mrs. Margaret was sorting through her son's belongings, she found a pawn ticket. The item that had been pawned was Stephen's wedding ring, and the pawner was none other than Evelyn. The deeper Mrs. Margaret dug, the less she could believe her eyes. When she tried to pay Evelyn's rent, the landlord revealed a horrifying truth. Evelyn frequently brought friends to the house for partying, throwing lavish gatherings even while Stephen was at work. These weren't ordinary friends, but strange men. The landlord even considered evicting them, but Stephen was a good man who always paid on time, so they let it slide. But when they learned he was dead, they finally spoke out about Evelyn's true nature. Still, the Philippine police dismissed all of Mrs. Margaret's suspicions. They said the evidence wasn't convincing enough, and that Evelyn might just be a grieving woman trying to survive after the death of her husband. Mrs. Margaret was angry, but not surprised. In a place like the Philippines, where crime runs rampant, the police were too accustomed to murders and robberies. A foreign woman crying foul over her son's death? Nothing to be concerned about. Mrs. Margaret turned to the British Embassy in the Philippines, hoping for intervention from the British government. But all she received was indifference. They told her she should return home, that interfering in another country's legal system wasn't feasible. Desperate, Mrs. Margaret realized that no one was on her side. No police, no government. No one wanted to touch a case that could implicate hidden powers. If the whole world turned its back, she would be the one to uncover the case. From there, she decided to work on the case herself, as the police should have. But danger was always lurking. A local resident warned her that anyone who benefited from Stephen's death would see her as an obstacle. If she kept investigating, she could be the next target. But she wasn't afraid. She had lost her son and had nothing left to lose. But the investigation was not easy. Mrs. Margaret realized she needed someone who knew the area. So she paid for a private investigator in the Philippines, assigning the task of secretly monitoring Evelyn 24/7. At the same time, she used money to exchange information, contacting Evelyn's family, friends, and acquaintances. A former colleague of Stephen revealed that in the last months of his life, Stephen had suspected Evelyn. Their relationship had become tense, primarily because Evelyn had an affair. Furthermore, when Stephen took his daughter Jessica to school, he discovered that she hadn't been enrolled. The tuition fees he had given Evelyn had been spent by her. After being confronted, Stephen had a serious talk with Evelyn. He demanded she choose between the family or her affair. But Evelyn didn't want to give up her comfortable life. When Stephen decided to cut her allowance, she became resentful towards him. Stephen's colleagues warned him that Evelyn might do something reckless, but Stephen still believed she was just angry. When the private investigator followed Evelyn, an important clue emerged. She frequently met a man named Arnold, even being affectionate with him at her own house. After weeks of surveillance, The investigator discovered two other men who also visited Evelyn's house regularly. One of them was Alexander, Arnold's friend. Clear photographs were taken, Evelyn and Arnold hugging at a hotel, exchanging cash, and laughing together. The evidence became clearer than ever. Evelyn was not a grieving widow. She was enjoying a luxurious life with Stephen's money, even before he died. Mrs. Margaret decided to present this evidence to the police. However, due to limited funds, all travel and investigation costs were paid by her. When the Philippine police arrested Arnold and Alexander, Michael, Stephen's colleague, immediately came to identify them. He confirmed they were the ones who broke into the house the night Stephen was killed. Arnold and Alexander were interrogated. Initially, they remained silent. But when the police presented recorded conversations between them and Evelyn, the truth was exposed. On August 16, 2002, with Michael's direct testimony, Arnold and Alexander were officially charged with murder. Mrs. Margaret believed justice had finally been served, but things were not as simple as they seemed. The two killers also named another person, Robin Butata, but they didn't know where he was. At this point, a kind police officer warned Mrs. Margaret, "Do you know, when a Westerner marries a Filipino woman, he doesn't just marry her, he marries her entire family. If she turns against you, the obedient cat could turn into a vicious tiger." This was a frightening warning. At the same time, the British embassy sent a letter asking Mrs. Margaret and her husband to leave the Philippines immediately. They had discovered something. Before being arrested, Arnold and Alexander were former police officers with close ties to the local mafia. If Mrs. Margaret stayed, she could very well be murdered. When she dies, the case will be buried forever. But Mrs. Margaret couldn't leave her grandchildren. Jessica and Joshua were still with Evelyn. If she left, Evelyn would have full control over the children. Mrs. Margaret secretly made a plan. She gave Evelyn some money, offering to send Jessica on a one-week vacation to England. For the money, Evelyn agreed immediately. In September 2002, Mrs. Margaret left the Philippines, taking Jessica with her, but she had no intention of giving up. She continued her investigation from afar. If the Philippine police wouldn't act, she would make the world pay attention to this case. She sent a series of emails to UK members of parliament, international lawyers, and human rights organizations. She wanted to put pressure on the Philippine police to continue their investigation. Evelyn was furiously angry. She filed a lawsuit against Mrs. Margaret for kidnapping. If she returned to the Philippines, Mrs. Margaret could be arrested at the airport. Mrs. Margaret didn't stop. She wanted to save Joshua, but Joshua had been taken by Evelyn to a secret location, and no one knew his whereabouts. Not only that, she received a message from an intermediary carrying a message from Evelyn. "Joshua will meet his father soon before you can find him." This was a death threat. Mrs. Margaret understood that Evelyn would never let Joshua escape her grasp easily. As news of the situation spread, Evelyn's relatives and friends began to provide secret information. Not out of kindness, but because they also hated Evelyn. Through the same intermediary, a relative of Evelyn finally revealed the truth. Joshua was on Datum Island, living with Evelyn's parents. Mrs. Margaret immediately contacted them, but she knew they wouldn't hand over her grandson just out of goodwill. She offered a sum of money in exchange for Joshua. Evelyn's parents, though heartbroken, knew they could not take proper care of Joshua. They accepted the deal. After more than a month of negotiation and completing legal procedures, Joshua was brought to England. But when he arrived, the boy was emaciated, with marks on his ankle, clear signs that he had been tied up to prevent him from escaping. Although Joshua had been rescued, the murderer had not been caught. The third killer, Robin Butata, was still at large. At this point, an unexpected detail emerged from one of Evelyn's relatives, who provided the exact identity of Robin, Gina's husband, Evelyn's sister. On June 14, 2003, 11 months after the incident, the Philippine police captured Robin. To reduce his sentence, Robin agreed to testify, and his account matched exactly with the statements from Arnold and Alexander. Evelyn was the true mastermind. She had hired Robin, Arnold, and Alexander to kill Stephen, promising each of them a large sum from his life insurance. She had given them the house keys, specifying the exact time to act. Evelyn's sole purpose: to kill her husband and inherit his wealth. On November 25, 2003, the trial of Arnold and Alexander took place. Robin's wife, Gina, also testified. She stated that Evelyn and Arnold were actually in a romantic relationship and had planned together after Stephen's death. Gina's testimony perfectly matched Robin's. The court concluded that Arnold and Alexander were guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced them to 30 years in prison without parole. Robin was granted immunity due to his cooperation with the police. But the biggest mastermind had still not been caught. Evelyn fled just before the arrest warrant was issued. The case seemed to have been forgotten. But Mrs. Margaret never forgot. On October 17, 2014, the police unexpectedly found Evelyn in a remote village in Rizal province. When arrested, Evelyn continued to claim her innocence, asserting she was not involved in the case. But no one believed her anymore. Evelyn's family and friends had turned their backs on her. Some even said that having a murderer in the family was the greatest shame. Evelyn was escorted to Manila to await trial. The entire nation of the Philippines was watching this sensational case. On November 25, 2004, the day of the final verdict, Mrs. Margaret and her husband were present in Manila, Philippines, after a long journey of thousands of miles. They had fought for more than 2 years, and today was the moment of judgment. The courtroom was packed. Journalists waited outside. The public was tense. Everyone wanted to know if the mastermind behind Stephen's death would finally pay the price. Evelyn was escorted in. She wore a white shirt, dark trousers, and sunglasses. No emotion, no signs of worry. She entered as if this was just a normal meeting. The judge read the indictment. The prosecutor announced that 14 witnesses were ready to testify. The evidence was solid, the testimonies consistent, Evelyn's crime was undeniable. But Evelyn remained stubborn. She continued to deny the charges, claiming she was innocent, that she had an alibi. But when asked to provide proof, Evelyn had nothing to show. After much debate, the court finally concluded that she was guilty of first-degree murder. The official sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Evelyn turned sharply to her lawyer, shouting, "No, it can't be. I didn't do anything." But everyone turned their backs on her. No one believed her anymore. After the trial, Mrs. Margaret's story became a phenomenon. Major newspapers reported on the relentless quest for justice by a great mother. The 14 witnesses who had helped Mrs. Margaret were threatened. Some had to move homes to avoid retaliation from dark forces. But thanks to international media attention, the case was finally judged fairly. Mrs. Margaret had sacrificed everything to bring Evelyn to justice. 2.5 years of sleepless nights, nearly exhausting all her wealth, even having to mortgage her house twice. But she never regretted it. Mrs. Margaret wrote a book titled For My Son. The book detailed her entire journey for justice. When asked why she didn't give up, Mrs. Margaret simply replied, "I just did what any mother would do in this situation." On that day, when leaving the courtroom, Mrs. Margaret felt peace for the first time. "Stephen, finally you can rest, as a mother's long journey for justice comes to an end." What do you think of this action? Please leave your comments below. The video ends here. If you found this story intriguing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so we can bring more strange and emotional stories. Thank you for following, and see you in the next video. December 25, 2022, in Paju, Gyeonggi Province, South Korea. The silence was broken by a midnight call to the police hotline. A woman's panicked voice, "Please help me. I found a dead body in my boyfriend's closet." The fear in her voice prompted the operator to immediately alert the regional police force. The police arrived quickly at the scene. There they were horrified to find the body of a middle-aged man curled up, wrapped in a thick blanket. Who was the victim, and why was he in the apartment? What was the perpetrator seeking in this older man? Upon closer examination, investigators began to notice signs that this case might not just be a straightforward murder, but rather part of a larger chain of crimes. Will this investigation turn out to be an unexpected journey in crime solving? Subscribe to our channel to explore this mystery with us. Paju, a small city in Gyeonggi Province, South Korea, is known for its serene beauty and fresh air. It's an ideal spot for those looking to escape Seoul's bustling atmosphere. Paju features not only gentle mountains and clear rivers, but also developing modern neighborhoods, creating a subtly blended atmosphere. But behind its peaceful charm, who would have thought that Paju was about to become the center of a horrific crime? A place that once seemed only to hold peace and happiness now hides dark secrets no one could have imagined. This case has shaken Paju and drawn the attention of all of South Korea. Returning to the time the case was discovered, it was Christmas. Kim Ji-ah planned to surprise her boyfriend, Lee Ki-young. They had been dating for almost a year, so she decided to visit his apartment unannounced. Ki-young's apartment was located in an upscale residential area in Paju, where most residents were from the middle and upper classes. The area was famous for its tranquility and privacy, with high-rise buildings, tight security, and modern security systems. Gia had the digital code to the apartment, so she easily entered, but her boyfriend appeared to be out. Gia decided to wait for him and took the opportunity to tidy up a bit. As she cleaned the living room, Gia noticed the place was messier than usual, with items scattered everywhere. A foul smell lingered in the air. Following the trail, Gia made her way to her boyfriend's bedroom. The smell seemed to be coming from the closet. Out of curiosity, Gia opened one side of the closet door. Instantly, a horrifying sight appeared before her. Behind the neatly hung clothes, something was tightly wrapped in a thick blanket. Gia's hands trembled as she pulled the blanket aside, only to scream in terror when she realized it was the body of a man. He was dead, cold and rigid. Panicked and terrified, Gia backed away and immediately called the police in a frantic voice. The luxurious apartment, a place where one would expect only happy moments, had now become the center of a crime investigation. Upon receiving the report, the police quickly arrived and secured the scene. Investigators meticulously documented every detail, from the apartment entrance to the living room, and finally to the bedroom where the body was discovered. In the living room, there were numerous dry bloodstains hastily wiped away, visible to the naked eye. The quiet space grew tense as they approached the closet. Forensic experts carefully pulled back the blanket wrapped around the body, revealing the corpse of a man showing signs of decomposition. The victim was around 60 years old, with multiple deep open wounds on his body, particularly on the head and face. The wounds seemed to have been caused by a sharp, thin object, likely a knife. The eyes and surrounding areas were heavily bruised, with a swollen forehead and deep cuts stretching from the cheeks to the temples. The bruises indicated the victim might have endured numerous blows before his death. Preliminary examination by the forensic team suggested the cause of death was severe head trauma. The estimated time of death was about 3 to 4 days prior, likely on the night of December 21st or early morning of December 22nd. Searching around the body, no personal items belonging to the victim were found. No phone, wallet, or ID. It seemed all identifying traces had been deliberately removed. The primary task now was to determine the victim's identity. Coincidentally, that same day, in the nearby city of Ilsan, located just a few dozen kilometers away, a missing person was reported who shared many characteristics with the discovered victim. The report was filed by the son of the missing person, a taxi driver named Park Jung-soo. According to the son's statement, his father, Mr. Park, 60 years old, had not returned home since December 20th. That day, Mr. Park was out driving his taxi as usual, but by the end of the day, he still hadn't come home. Concerned, the son tried calling him, but there was no response. He initially thought his father might have fallen asleep at a friend's house after drinking, so he didn't report it to the police immediately. By the afternoon of December 21st, the family received a strange text message from Mr. Park's phone. The message said that his phone had run out of battery the previous day, which was why he hadn't responded immediately. He added that he would be working far from home and would not return for some time. The message offered no other specific details. In the following days, he continued to send texts home but never picked up any calls. Suspecting something was wrong, particularly since he was not answering calls, the family decided to report it to the police on December 25th. Paju police immediately connected this information with the missing person case, and suspicion began to form. Could the missing man and the body in the closet be the same person? Investigators contacted Mr. Park Jung-soo's son to gather additional information and identifying details. Thanks to the family's detailed descriptions of Mr. Park's height, build, and a small scar on his neck, police initially confirmed that the body in the closet and the missing taxi driver were likely the same person. Through careful DNA testing, the official results were announced. The body in the closet was indeed Mr. Park Jung-soo. Police determined that this was no longer a simple missing person case, but had escalated into a mysterious murder. Police interrogated Kim Ji-ah, the first person to discover the body. She stated that the apartment belonged to her boyfriend, Lee Ki-young. According to her, on the night of December 20th, Lee Ki-young came to her home and invited her entire family to dinner. The event took place at an upscale restaurant, where Lee made a good impression on her family. After the meal, her parents left first, while Lee Ki-young prepared to drive back to his apartment in Paju. However, he had consumed quite a bit of alcohol and showed signs of intoxication. Concerned for his safety, she advised him to call a driver or use a safe driving service. However, Lee Ki-young refused and insisted that he was still able to drive home safely. The tense conversation led to a brief argument. She left disappointed, and Lee Ki-young drove himself home. The following day, on December 21st, Lee Ki-young took the initiative to make amends and apologized for the previous night's argument. He gifted her an expensive pair of couple rings worth 5 million won to show his sincerity. Additionally, he took her shopping and bought her a high-end handbag valued at 60 million won. In total, Lee Ki-young spent about 65 million won in an effort to make peace and mend their relationship. This is why Ji-ah wanted to surprise her boyfriend on Christmas Day, as shown at the beginning of the video. For now, the police confirmed that Lee Ki-young was the prime suspect. But where was he? Ji-ah tried calling him multiple times, but although the phone rang, there was no answer. Police decided to trace his phone to determine his location. The search led them to a bar in the city center, where Lee Ki-young was drinking with friends. In the lively atmosphere of the bar, Lee Ki-young was unaware that the police were closing in. While he was in a drunken haze, a team of officers quietly entered the bar and requested that he come to the police station for questioning. Lee Ki-young was completely caught off guard and unable to react. In the interrogation room, when police asked about the man's body that his girlfriend had found in the closet, he stammered, trying to come up with an excuse but couldn't offer a reasonable explanation. Moreover, the police found the missing taxi driver's mobile phone on him. This was undeniable evidence linking him to the driver's death. Under this pressure, Lee Ki-young finally confessed. He admitted that he had killed the taxi driver, but claimed it was an accident and that the driver had forced him into it. The incident happened on the night of December 20th, when Lee Ki-young hosted a dinner with his girlfriend's family at a luxurious restaurant. During the meal, he drank quite a bit and was clearly intoxicated, but tried to act sober. After her family left, Lee Ki-young insisted on driving home himself, despite his girlfriend's advice to hire a driver. But out of pride and arrogance, he refused and stumbled to his car, leaving the parking lot alone. On the way home, due to the influence of alcohol, he lost control of the wheel, frequently veering across lanes and speeding. At a sharp curve on a narrow road, he suddenly swerved into the opposite lane and collided head-on with an oncoming taxi. The impact was strong, leaving both cars severely damaged. Fortunately, Lee Ki-young was not seriously injured, but the taxi driver, Mr. Park Jung-soo, suffered minor injuries and was disoriented. His car was also heavily damaged. Both men exited their vehicles and began arguing. The taxi driver quickly noticed the strong smell of alcohol on Lee Ki-young. He threatened that if he was not compensated properly, he would report the accident to the police. This was what Lee Ki-young feared most, as he had a prior record related to driving under the influence. In the past, Lee Ki-young had caused a serious accident while driving drunk. The accident happened about 3 years ago when he lost control and crashed into a roadside fence in the outskirts of Incheon. The previous accident didn't cause major injuries, but Lee Ki-young was arrested and fined heavily, and his driver's license was suspended for 100 days. Since then, he has lived in constant fear of being caught driving drunk again, as it could lead to jail time. To settle with the taxi driver and avoid being reported to the police, Lee Ki-young decided to invite him to his apartment. He hoped to negotiate a compensation arrangement at home without involving the law. After bringing the taxi driver to his apartment, Lee Ki-young began discussing compensation to avoid police involvement. To placate him, Lee initially offered a compensation of 1 million won, approximately 760 US. However, the taxi driver, realizing Lee Ki-young was intoxicated, rejected this amount. He felt it was insufficient to cover the damages caused by the accident, as well as the legal risks Lee Ki-young might face. The driver demanded a significantly higher compensation, up to 10 million won, approximately 7,600 US. He explained that if he wasn't fairly compensated, he would report the incident to the police. Lee Ki-young felt angry and tense upon hearing the large sum requested by the driver. However, he tried to remain calm and pretended to agree to the driver's demand to buy time to think and plan. By this point, his intent to kill had already taken root. Pretending to agree, Lee Ki-young asked the driver to wait in the living room while he went to fetch the money. But along with the money, he also concealed a knife. While the driver was counting the money Lee had handed him, Lee Ki-young took advantage of the moment the driver was distracted. He pulled out the knife he had hidden and attacked the man's head and face repeatedly. Caught completely off guard, Park Jung-soo had no time to defend himself. He fell immediately to the ground, overwhelmed by the fatal blows. Once Lee Ki-young confirmed that Mr. Park was dead, he stopped, his hand holding the knife still trembling. The situation had escalated far beyond his initial intent. Lee Ki-young quickly wrapped the body in a large blanket, attempting to conceal all traces of blood and wounds. He stuffed the body into a deep corner of the closet, thinking no one would easily find it, and then proceeded to clean up the crime scene. Since killing the victim was not his initial intention, Lee Ki-young hadn't prepared a plan for dealing with the body. To mislead the driver's family temporarily, he used the victim's phone to send a message to the victim's son, pretending that the driver was still alive and working far away. As for the victim's car, Lee Ki-young drove it to a parking lot about 1 kilometer from the apartment, an area with few passers-by and little attention. There he parked the car in a hidden corner and erased all footage from the dashcam, ensuring no evidence remained that captured him or the victim on that fateful night. However, he hadn't anticipated his girlfriend's surprise visit, which ultimately led to the discovery of his crime. It seemed that the case might be concluding, but as they completed the file, the police uncovered an unusual detail. The apartment was registered under a 50-year-old woman named Kim Eun-jin, not Lee Ki-young. When asked about Miss Kim, Lee Ki-young admitted she was his former lover, but claimed he didn't know her current whereabouts. This immediately raised suspicions among the investigators. Kim Eun-jin, born in 1972, came from a small fishing village in Busan, in southern South Korea. She left her hometown at a young age to start a new life in a big city, seeking a stable future. After years of work and saving, she opened a small seafood restaurant Paju and bought herself a luxury apartment, the same one where Lee Ki-young currently resided. Lee Ki-young met Miss Kim at her restaurant. Over time, the two developed feelings for each other, and Lee eventually moved in with her in this apartment, living together as a couple about 2 years ago. But nearly a year ago, neighbors stopped seeing Miss Kim around, and her restaurant closed without explanation. Many were curious, but assumed she had gone abroad for business or moved elsewhere, so they didn't pay much attention. Expanding their investigation, the police discovered that Miss Kim's savings had been entirely withdrawn about 8 months prior, totaling up to 100 million won, around $75,000 USD. All transactions were made via online banking and transferred directly into Lee Ki-young's account. Furthermore, Miss Kim's apartment had been mortgaged by Lee Ki-young to secure a large bank loan, amounting to approximately 150 million won. During questioning, Lee Ki-young offered vague responses about Miss Kim and couldn't explain her current whereabouts. When police mentioned the withdrawn funds, he looked nervous and claimed Miss Kim had asked him to manage her finances. When looking for more clues among Lee's friends, investigators discovered that about 8 months ago, Lee Ki-young frequently hosted lavish parties, generously inviting friends. When asked how he had suddenly come into wealth, Lee explained that he had made a big profit from an investment. The timing of Miss Kim's bank transactions matched precisely with the periods when Lee Ki-young was spending extravagantly. Miss Kim's disappearance. The financial transfers and testimonies from those around him led police to a hypothesis. Miss Kim may have become a victim of Lee Ki-young's scheme to take over her assets. Since they had no means of contacting Miss Kim, the police decided to conduct a second search of the apartment. Given that Lee had murdered the taxi driver so brutally, it seemed entirely possible he might have killed Miss Kim as well. This time, the police conducted a meticulous inspection of every small corner in the room using luminol, a chemical that reacts with the iron in blood's hemoglobin. When sprayed onto surfaces, if there's residual blood that's been cleaned up, it will glow faintly blue in the dark. As anticipated, in the bathroom, police found multiple traces of blood, even on the ceiling. They immediately collected DNA samples from these blood traces to compare with Ms. Kim Yoon-jin's genetic information. To conduct the DNA matching, a team of investigators traveled all the way to Ms. Kim's hometown in Busan to obtain genetic samples from her family members. It was a long journey, but necessary to confirm if Miss Kim had indeed fallen victim to a crime in her own apartment. The DNA analysis results matched perfectly. The blood sample found on the bathroom wall belonged to Kim Eun-jin. Faced with this DNA evidence, Lee Ki-young had no way out. At first, he tried to appear calm, but under the relentless questioning and irrefutable evidence, he eventually confessed to his crime. According to Lee's statement, about 8 months ago, he invited Miss Kim to drink and, taking advantage of her inebriated state, secretly added sedatives to her glass. Once she lost consciousness, he moved her to the bathroom, where he carried out a brutal murder. He admitted to strangling Miss Kim until she died. To dispose of the body, he used a knife from the house to dismember her in the bathroom, making transportation easier. He then dumped parts of her body in the Han River at various locations, attempting to erase all traces. After committing the crime, Lee closed Miss Kim's restaurant and impersonated her, using her phone to message acquaintances, saying she had gone abroad for business. In this way, he intended to seize all her assets. Beyond the primary motive of seizing assets, there was another reason: their significant age difference. Over time, Lee became more interested in younger women, particularly Kim Ji-ah. He preferred being with her rather than living with someone as old as his own mother. Based on the information provided by the killer, the police attempted to locate Miss Kim's remains, but given the time that had passed, the search was unsuccessful. Once the investigation was complete, Lee Ki-young's case file was sent to the court to prepare for trial. Public outrage was intense over his heinous actions, from murdering Kim Eun-jin for her assets to killing an innocent taxi driver. The trial date was set, and the courtroom was packed with citizens, journalists, and the victims' families. The atmosphere was tense as everyone awaited the verdict for the murderer who had caused such horror. During the trial, the prosecutor presented compelling evidence, from bloodstains on the bathroom walls to financial transactions and detailed testimonies from Lee's current girlfriend. All the evidence pointed to Lee having systematically planned the asset seizure and murder. Based on irrefutable evidence and Lee Ki-young's confession, the jury quickly reached a unanimous conclusion. Lee Ki-young was guilty of premeditated murder, accompanied by violence and asset seizure. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence received public support, with those present feeling somewhat comforted that justice had been served. Though still grieving, the victims' families could be at peace knowing the criminal would no longer pose a threat to society. The trial concluded, marking the end of a shocking and sensational case. Lee Ki-young was returned to prison, where he would spend the rest of his life bearing the weight of his crimes. This story has become a warning about greed and cruelty, reminding us of the severe consequences of inhumane actions. This video ends here. If you found it interesting and informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to explore more stories with us.